Today, strangely enough, we're going to see as big a contrast as you'll ever see in this series with two artists from the same part of the world and the same century, Reubens and Vermeer. Now we're going to start with Reubens. Reubens is hard to teach, frankly. My daughter teaches art history for the University of Cincinnati, and I haven't had a chance to ask her how she teaches Reubens, because Reubens is tricky to teach in the modern world. In a few moments, you'll see why. Part of the issue with Reubens is I can say so much about him and get in so many arguments with you about him, and then you can't get to the second artist, who in fact you will probably see is an artist I more personally favor. So anyway, Reubens represents a kind of artistic process that doesn't fit the current stereotype of art. He comes from a fairly wealthy background. His father was a lawyer. He mixes with the aristocracy throughout Europe. He's widely traveled, spends a lot of time in Italy, knows just about everybody in Europe. He actually functions as a diplomat. He's from Brussels. And he functions as a diplomat throughout Europe, knows everybody, runs this giant workshop. Some people would call it a painting factory. He has like 100 assistants. Now imagine how many painting commissions you have to keep 100 young artists occupied. Currently, the current number of extant Reubens paintings is around 1,400. A lot of them quite large. Our second artist we're going to look at, Vermeer. The number of paintings we have of Vermeer is 34. Reubens is an artist of tremendous intelligence. Artists fit in a kind of odd psychological profile. I've read several studies of artists' temperaments and so on, and typically artists fit in the higher intelligence range, but almost never in the genius category. Only very rarely does an artist fit in the genius category. Leonardo, of course, would be an example of that. Probably Michelangelo. Reubens, quite certainly. He spoke 5 languages. Just a brilliant guy, very facile technician, extraordinarily gifted person with a very active, social, exuberant personality. Vermeer, we're going to see, is a guy who lives in his small town his whole life. Only a few people know him, and he has a much quiet temperament. Anyway, this exuberance in Reubens creates certain issues that we'll start to uncover as we move along here. But the theme today is the idea of movement in art, action. Remember, each time we do one of these lectures, there's a larger theme that we're coalescing these artists around. Anyway, let's look at the first Reubens, and I chose this one simply to show you him as the successful artist that he actually is. This is him with his first wife, who died before the Reubens did, and then he married a much younger woman. Now you could ask yourself, how do you do a portrait like this? Obviously, he's the artist making it, so he's making himself up in this image. But you can see they're both dressed in this very fashionable way. They're the kind of epitome of style in that particular world. So there's not much action here other than this quiet little gesture of their hands clasping. Now, can we see the next one? I've shown this one to those of you who saw our other lecture series before. Look at the measurements on this, 15 feet by 11 feet. It's a huge, huge painting, and it raises an issue. We're going to talk about the content of this painting, but before I do that, I need to mention to you that it's very hard to talk about Reubens or Vermeer religiously, because in both cases, they live in an age where Catholics and Protestants are killing each other. You don't get the Westphal treaty until the 1640s to create peace between Protestants and Catholics. Both of them, however, have Catholic and Protestant tendencies and part of their history. Reubens was born in Germany, which obviously he would have had Lutheran background at that point. And his father was Protestant. Brussels was at this time controlled by Spain and therefore was dominantly Catholic. This Protestant churches never during this era had religious paintings like this in them. So this is obviously done for a Catholic church. And I use this painting as an example of the energy and the vitality of Reubens. I comment, look carefully, of course it's the raising of the cross. You see Jesus looks like a professional wrestler. Reubens just can't help but exaggerate musculature and so on. And I start to count the number of people who are raising this cross, and it's around 8, maybe 9. And it's something that maybe 2 strong men could do. It even has a Cocker Spaniel in the lower corner there. It's as dramatic a painting as you could make of this subject, but one can start to ask the question, how deep a faith does it represent? It's like the faith translated into a physical, athletic dimension rather than a deeper inner kind of dimension. And he seemed to be willing to do paintings like this for Catholic churches, and he did several. This is only one of the most dramatic examples, but one has to ask oneself, how deep were the convictions, even, and what's problematic about this guy? He's a genius. He's as good as it gets when it comes to the technical side of visual arts. I feel sort of stretched when I have to talk about him and in ways that are negative, because in fact there's so much positive here. There's so many gifts represented here that need to be acknowledged and appreciated. Needless to say, our theme is action. Okay, you get the concept there, I hope. Can we see the next one, please? Another part of Reubens that's relatively hard to talk about is his exposure of human flesh in a way that skirts categories. Now, I don't want to get into a really lengthy explanation here, but in the visual arts, you have the idea of nude and the idea of naked. Nude is a classical concept of representing the figure in a highly idealized way, and it's not a psychological state at all. It's simply the body in physical representation. There's no sense of shame on the face of the figure represented. As I say, it's partly emphasizing a kind of idealized aspect of anatomy. So it's turned into almost geometric form. That's what nudity is. It's used throughout the visual arts, but it's not a moral category. It's not thought to be and not meant to be immoral in any way. Nakedness is more a consciousness on the part of the person represented that they don't have any clothes on. It's a social category, and there's a kind of self-awareness associated with that. Also, nakedness usually represents the body in much more detailed, less idealized ways. So wrinkles, bulges, and so on get represented. Reubens, as you'll see as we move along in his work, skirts between those categories. His figures are generally regarded as nude, certainly in the psychological sense. His figures have almost no psychology, I might add, by the way. They're almost purely physical beings. We looked at Rembrandt last time, and everything about Rembrandt is psychological. Reubens is just the reverse of that. It's all physical stuff. Anyway, he just sort of skirts the edge between those categories, and as you'll see as we move along, there's a tendency to have a naked look to the figures. Here, of course, he has Eve represented by reaching the apple, but in some ways, he's a little more fair in this image because he's got Adam right next to her, quite aware of what's going on. Usually she catches all the grief associated with temptation. But you can see he chose a subject not particularly for religious reasons, but because he wanted to represent a couple bodies. And notice he generally represents figures in normal human scale. Look at the size of this work. It's 8 feet by 6. Now, can we see the next one, please? This is a painting I want to ask my daughter, how do you teach on this painting? Because it's a rape scene. As you can see, he loves to represent the figures, and nudity, nakedness, musculature are kind of what his work is about. How could you make a more active-looking painting than this? You see, this guy just can't sit still. There's something about the way he thinks and functions that demands this kind of energy in his work. And the question I want to ask my daughter is, how do you show your female students a work like this without them walking out of the room? I'm not showing it to offend any of you, but in fact, it's a profoundly offensive painting to the modern sensibility. Can we see the next one, please? Again, look at the power in Hercules here. He's got his big club, and he's overcoming discord. And look carefully at discord. She's female. Again, the question is, how do you show this to the modern generation of students without being physically attacked? Again, action is everything here. Strangely enough, it's all about heroic virtue overcoming discord. Frankly, I find the painting discordant. It's kind of tangled. It's not very ordered. I don't know how to describe it much beyond what I've just said. Can we see the next one, please? In his latter years, he built a couple villas. Again, he was lavishly wealthy. And one of these villas was out in the countryside. And he did a few landscapes towards the end of his career. You look at the scale of this painting, you see it's much smaller now. This is a more private painting, him just enjoying himself painting. I don't know if he did it for a patron or not. But again, it looks like a kind of revelry. They're dancing around in this oval kind of shape. A lot of flesh exposed. And although you don't see any evidence of alcohol, we got our little dog in the corner here, by the way, you get a sense that they're maybe a little over exuberant in their dance here. Maybe some alcohol is involved in this. But again, it's all about bodies and motion. And that's what the painting is about. The landscape is simply a backdrop for that theme in the painting. And I think that's our last Reubens. Now, Vermeer is Dutch, and of course, Belgium and Holland are right next to each other, so they're part of the same world. You look at the dates, and you'll notice Vermeer died as a young man. He was only 43 when he died. Now, one of the reasons he might have died, he has 11 kids. That might be one of the reasons that we only have 34 paintings of Vermeer. By the way, he was an art dealer. He sold other artists' art. And his work fits in one of the Dutch categories. In Holland, remember, there's no real religious category for art, so that you don't have any churches aren't buying art, so religious art is out of the question. So all you've got is portraiture, landscape, interiors, history painting. There are 4 or 5 categories, and if you're a Dutch artist, it's a very active market because the Dutch are a very prosperous country at this time. A lot of very rich people in Holland. And they want ways of demonstrating their resources, so they're buying art much more than any other country in Europe. Individual patrons of art, and they buy according to categories. If you want to be known, you work along a certain category. When we looked at Rembrandt last week, I mentioned he fundamentally fitted in the category of portraiture, but he broke all the categories. He did religious painting and all different other kinds of work. Vermeer stays pretty much within his category, which is interior domestic scenes. Again, it's hard to categorize him in religious terms because he, as a relatively young man, he converted to Catholicism. When he died at age of 43, he was buried in a Protestant church. So who knows what happened there. Again, because he wasn't well known, he worked mostly in Delft. At one time I mentioned to you, where you work as an artist, when we talked about Chuck Close, who worked in New York, matters in terms of your relative prominence. Delft was not on the international art scene. So he was well known in Delft. In fact, he at one point led the St. Luke Guild, which was a guild of artists in Delft. But it's not a prominent place. You don't become a famous artist if you're painting in Delft. If you're in Amsterdam, like Rembrandt was, you've got some international recognition possibilities because Amsterdam is a major port and all kinds of countries come and go and whatever. So he's working in a category that, as I say, is a kind of highly restricted category, and there's I'm not at all familiar with any religious paintings by him in the 34 that we have. But ironically, he lived next to what was called a secret church. In Holland, how this happened, first of all, try to imagine how you keep a church secret. They tolerated Catholics worshiping there, but it's a Calvinist, very kind of rigid kind of religious background, but they tolerated Catholics, but they didn't allow them to make public sanctuaries. He lived right next door to one of these secret churches. They're called secret churches, but it's hard for me to comprehend how you could ever keep something like that really secret. So there was some kind of level of tolerance going on there. Now, as I've said, our primary theme here is action, but you're going to see a secondary theme, and let's look at the first work here. Most of the subjects in Vermeer paintings are women. Not exclusively. You'll see some with couples in them. But they're women represented in a much more natural way than these Rubenesque figures. Here you have just a modest milkmaid. Look at the scale of the painting. All of his paintings are this kind of scale. It's he was supposedly a very slow painter. And even though he wasn't a rich man, he used very, very expensive materials in his painting. You'll see the blue of the gown of the milkmaid and some blue on the tabletop a rag sort of drip on the edge of the table there. That blue is extremely expensive. It's lapis lazuli, which is a semi-precious stone. If you wanted a really stable blue in that world, remember back then paint didn't come in tubes. Artists had to mix their own paint, get all these minerals and figure out how to make the colors. Anyway, lapis created a very stable, brilliant blue, but extraordinarily expensive. And so he used materials like that. The paintings he sold, as far as we know their market value, were priced a little higher than the average artist in the Dutch realm. But you'll notice his main theme is a domestic interior. And you'll notice almost nothing, as you look at these paintings, you'll see almost nothing happens. It's as kind of quiet and uneventful as you can make a painting, and then try to create it in a way that's interesting to look at. Reubens gives us so much to look at that you almost feel overwhelmed. Vermeer just trims it back, gets down to a most basic, simple environment. And then he spends a tremendous amount of time thinking about and painting light. You'll see in all the Reubens paintings we're going to be looking at, or the Vermeer paintings we're going to be looking at, the light always comes from the left-hand side through this grilled window. His studio is on the second floor of his house. By the way, he ended up dying bankrupt, and he had this large house that he had inherited from his father-in-law, and he also had a tavern. And he's an art dealer, and he also ran the tavern with 11 kids. Now you wonder why he only did 34 paintings. But he took a lot of time with the paintings that he did. And here you see this quiet domestic scene. His house had 8 rooms on the bottom floor and then a second floor. So it was a large home, and his studio was on the second floor. Can we see the next one, please? Some of you might know a little bit about this title because it was a book written with this title and a film. Colin Firth, the British actor, played Vermeer in that film, Girl with a Pearl Earring. This is the painting in which that book and film was based. And you see, it's just a young girl. Again, we don't know who she is, don't know anything about her. She's certainly not one of any historical significance or prominence. And about the only thing that's happening here is she apparently has become aware of us. And notice how she's turned her head and her eyes are moving off to the side. And so you get this quiet little gesture. Again, there's nothing particularly sensual about the treatment of a woman. It's just a realistic woman of the time, a young girl who has a very pleasant face, but there's nothing meant to be overly dramatic or special about this. He takes the ordinary and somehow finds a way with the quality of light and the quality of gaze to make it memorable, to make it extraordinary. Most of us who are artists because we don't find language satisfying enough to say what we want to say. We can only say it through a visual form. I find Rembrandt and Vermeer among the hardest artists to talk about because there's a level of awareness, a level of insight that goes a little beyond language. It just becomes a memorable image, but it's very hard to fully explain it and why it's memorable. And again, look at the size of it. Very small, photographic size practically. Can we see the next one? Here's his studio again. He has certain props in his studio. One of the most common one, is this big drape that looks, some people are not sure because of the way it's represented in other paintings, whether it's an oriental rug or not. But anyway, here it's represented as this big drape. You'll notice it creates a barrier between us, because we're in the space that this barrier represents a little bit as a different space than the space of the painter and his subject. And so you get a feeling that you're kind of peering in on a kind of quiet, private scene, that you're getting this privileged access to what's going on here, but it's not a public thing at all. Now he creates a certain structure in his paintings that reinforce this quiet, gentle, domestic content. Some of you might remember some time ago when we talked about modern art, there's a famous Dutch painter who moved to America named Mondrian. He's one of the first great abstractionists. And Mondrian creates these very simple paintings, again, Dutch in background, but with a right-angled, very organized format, with only three colors, the three primary colors, and white and black. And some people have said Mondrian gets that whole organized format from Vermeer. You see, he almost always shows us a little bit of the ceiling to create a stable horizontal line. Now you get this big map in the background that somehow represents the other outside world. He's quite aware that there's a world out beyond what he's doing here. And so he gives us a sense that world is out there. Now the painter is painting his subject, again, fully clothed, and maybe she's doing something symbolic. I'm not sure quite what that incident. She obviously is holding a musical instrument, and then what that big book she's holding is, I don't know quite what that represents, nor am I quite sure what this funny little, I call that a hat, but I don't know what that is on her head. But you'll notice she's just looking down. She's got this very calm look about her. And again, you get this wonderful soft light coming in on the left there. And again, look at the deep blue of her gown. That's lapis lazuli again. You see the infinite care he puts into the subject. Look at the chandelier hanging up there. He's very careful about a meticulous rendition of that. And then he always shows us this gridded floor that is black and white marble tiles. Again, a kind of organized structural format. Now, some of the accuracy of Vermeer's painting has caused a certain amount of discussion in the art world. I don't know if any of you have ever heard about what's called a camera obscura. A camera obscura is a object well before photography was invented. Artists discovered that if you create a box-like space and put a hole in one wall and get a bright light on the other side, that light goes through that hole in the wall, just like a lens of a camera, and creates an image on the back side of this box that's exactly like what's out there, but it's upside down. Some feel that maybe he used camera obscura because his paintings have such accurate perspective and detailing. But remember, he died, and he died as a young man, and he was poor at that point. When his possessions were auctioned off, he had 2 easels, he had 2 palettes, a few brushes. There was no camera obscura. There were 1 or 2 mirrors. So there might be some question he used mirrors in some way. But the other part of this is you got male and female here. But notice how quietly they're related to each other. It's an activity, painting, which we would imagine represents a kind of emotion. But in some way it's presented to us in such a quiet, calm manner that you sort of reflect about what is painting meaning? What does it mean when you do something like this? And you got the guy and the gal, as well as we can see them, representing roughly the same ages, but not in some kind of physical, sexual energy that we saw in Reubens. Can we see the next one, please? Here's that drape I was talking about. If you look at the floor, it's got a fringe on it, and it looks here more like an oriental carpet than it does a drape. We see a little more of the room now. Again, the light coming from the opposite side. Remember, this guy is a dealer. He sells art of other artists. And you see a couple paintings on the wall, and they're done by artists that he knows who are impressed by the Italian manner that Caravaggio develops with dramatic darks and lights. And you get a little sense of that as you see those paintings. One of them is cut off a little bit. But again, you see, she gives us a ceiling line, even though the ceiling apparently is a gabled roof. You see the beams there. As it goes across the painting, it creates a more horizontal plane with a slight diagonal, and then he exaggerates the depth of the room with 1-point perspective of that lower wall. What that violin, bass viol, whatever that is on the floor, what that represents, I'm not really quite sure. This instrument is called a virginal, and it's, I think, an early form of harpsichord piano. It's a stringed instrument. And look at the figures. She's playing the instrument supposedly, and her teacher is next to her, looking over that way, but he's not gesturing in any kind of way. Now, at one point, I was a dean of a school of music, and most of my music teachers did not teach like this. They were sometimes pretty vociferous if students made a mistake. But again, you see, the sex is represented, but in a totally discrete way. Can we see the next one? Again, it's the same room. Lights coming from the same direction. Hints of other artists' work on the wall. But now we've got someone who's thinking about the world outside that little room. He's a geographer. His business is to map the world out there. And so, again, you see, it's drama, but it's just a subtle, quiet drama. Takes you a while to figure out how it's happening. But anyway, this guy's looking out the window, and you get a sense he's thinking about something. He's got a tool in his hand that looks like a compass. And look at, behind him is a cabinet, and notice on top of the cabinet is the globe representing the whole world. The subtle light again, that whole light, as I say, Caravaggio did this light thing, but in a much more dramatic way than this. Dramatic dark, dramatic light, and this light has a soft, gentle warmth about it. It's hard to imagine an artist getting sunlight represented more completely and better than this. A little chaos introduced into the painting because looks like a book or something on the floor there, kind of misarranged with a piece of paper underneath it. But then you get the stiff verticality of what appears to be the edge of a cabinet, and then above it, the painting, and then the cabinet on the other side of the room. And notice he's wearing a blue robe again. And by the way, blue is a color we call a cool color. The spectrum is usually defined in terms of warm colors associated with things like sun and fire and so on. And then cool colors associated with things like water and sky. And again, objects that warm colors give off energy because they're associated with objects that give off energy. Cool colors, just the reverse. They don't give off energy. They pull inward, they shrink, they make an object look a little smaller. Warm colors will make the object look larger because they represent a kind of energy. To highlight the blue, he gives us that red or peach colored sash that he wears around his neck. Who the models were in these paintings, we have no idea. Yes.
Could you tell what's on the wall?
Yeah, the inscription up there? Yeah, I'm not sure what that's obviously looks like some Roman numerals up there. I don't know if that's the date of the painting or what that is. By the way, this is a guy who might have had a pupil or two, but had no giant factory workshop like Reubens had. And I think we're getting towards the end here. Do we have another one? I thought I want you to see this one where he breaks out of the category a little bit. This is a Dutch home. They made their homes typically along some main street or some cases a canal, and they are flat facades, almost always 2 and 3 and 4 stories. And in this particular case, we're out of doors, but again, you get an intimate sense of the indoor. If you look carefully, you see 3 servants there. You might miss the one on the ground there. I'm not quite sure what she's doing, but she's bent down there, and there looks like some ledge or something above her head. Then you've got another servant down this walkway, and you actually can see the interior a little bit with another servant there. She appears to be seated, and I'm not sure if she's sewing or what she's doing. Again, it's a simple, non-pretentious representation of a modest home, but it follows what I've been saying about his work. It has this very stable geometric structure about it. He gives us a frontal view of this thing. Now we can see down this walkway in one-point perspective. If he's representing buildings, he almost always does it in one-point perspective. He did a view of Delft where he might have represented a few of the buildings in two-point perspective. But typically he uses one point to create that simple, clear look of the image. I think that's our last image, is it not? I've left 10 minutes again, like I usually do, for any questions. Yes?
This building, would he have painted it as he was sitting out on the street? Or would he have imagined it and then gone into his building to paint it?
I'm not, honestly, I don't know how to answer that. What he might have done, what artists typically did in this era, is paint is not portable. You can't take it places. So you go to wherever you want to paint, and you either paint with watercolor, which is portable, or you draw the scene, you sketch it. And then you recreate it in your studio. And given a scene like this, I suspect that's what he did. You know, you could sketch something like this in 15, 20 minutes, not with the figures in it, but I think he probably invented the figures. It's pretty hard to imagine those women posing for him like that. Any other questions in the back there?
When you have a large studio like Reubens does, how do modern day artists know what Reubens did and what his students did?
That's a good question. It's a whole field of scholarship associated with that sort of thing. It's the same kind of scholarship associated with the work of Rembrandt. The self-portraits I showed last time, we think are authentic self-portraits, but Rembrandt let his students copy his self-portraits. So figuring that out is not simple. They do all kinds of chemical analysis of the paints. They do microscopic analysis of the brushwork. Each artist has a characteristic movement of their brush and so on. And so it's a whole field of science in itself, authenticating these works. A major part of this is what we call provenance. Provenance is simply a history of ownership. If we know a prominent patron bought such and such a painting, they wouldn't buy a student work. They would have bought a work by Rembrandt or Vermeer. And then, if we have a history of the ownership of that work right up to the modern day, we can be fairly certain that it's an authentic work by that artist. The signature we like to think of as the marker, but it's really not. Signatures can be pretty easily replicated. In fact, some of the research material Jana and I work with for these lectures, we get off the internet, and it shows us the artist's signatures, and they're really pretty easy to replicate. But anyway, it's a scientific kind of thing, and like most things with art, it's not an absolute science. It's not a perfect science. But you know, the students might be working with cheaper canvas. Let's say Vermeer, with his expensive materials, probably painted, I don't know, he might have painted on wood. Artists of this era sometimes painted on wood. Reubens did a lot of his painting on wood. But Vermeer might have painted on linen canvas, which is more expensive canvas than cotton canvas. So those are the kind of markers they work towards, but it's not easy. And the question I suppose the layperson can ask themselves, if it takes an absolute expert to figure out whether this is an authentic painting, why can't I buy a reproduction of it for $10 and be happy with it? Can I have any other questions? Yes.
I own that one, not the authentic one. And I bought it, I just loved it, was the main reason I bought it. But I think it also was fascinating to me that it was painted in 1658. And I think I bought it because I loved that city so much that I wanted, I don't know what that city is, but I wanted a replication of what still exists today, which is so fascinating to me that Europe is so good about holding on to their architecture and
their traditions, right? And especially the Dutch. Ironically, the Dutch culture is one of the most advanced, liberal in Europe, but they're extremely conscious of their heritage and protecting that heritage.
not that I didn't love the interior ones too. I remember standing and debating which one was I going to buy, and then this one won. But I love all of his work.
Yeah.
But I would not buy the first painter. I did not like Reubens is too chaotic. It would cause me to feel anxious all the time.
Remember, Vermeer's market wasn't grand public spaces. It was living rooms and dining rooms. This wasn't Reubens' market, but this was Vermeer's market. And so they're meant to fit in that kind of environment. That's why they have a kind of durable lasting quality, that they're the kind of thing you could live with without having to react to every 10 minutes. In the back, we had a question.
I was curious to know on Reubens of the rape scene, and he did something similar to that. Yeah. But do we know who his patron was that commissioned that, perhaps?
Mean the raising of the cross, is that the Reubens?
You know, the rape scene, the rape of whoever.
Rape scene.
Oh, yeah. My guess, most of his patrons, of course, given that era, were male. And one can easily imagine a male patron wanting a painting like that from him. And in fact, one of the things that was part of that world that we find kind of weird, that people would buy paintings like that have a somewhat a lascivious quality to them, and then they would put a drape over them and only show them to their favored friends. It's, you know, yeah, go figure. Any other questions I can help you with? Thank you again all for coming. I appreciate it. I hope to see you on the 5th of December.